Hello, welcome to episode 13 of the Wilder podcast. I am Tom Constable and this is Chloe.
Good evening, everyone.
So I suppose we should start at the start, a very brief introduction to the Wilder podcast. If you're new to this, welcome to listening to it. Chloe and I are husband and wife. We are doing a myriad of things, but we are wilding our 80 acres in Monmouthshire, and the podcast is about interviewing really interesting guests and also just educating ourselves on things like wilding, rewilding, or sustainability or climate change, and really exploring the so what's associated with that. Why is it important? Why should we care about it? This episode is definitely no exception. We are doing a deep dive, as they would say, into a concept with our guest this week, so please stick around with Dr. Stephen Carver. He's one of the senior lecturers over at Leeds University, and we're talking about specifically rewilding, or what we mean, they mean, everyone means by rewilding, and what academics mean by it, and why should we care about the word, what it means, and how to define it. So definitely want to skip around to it. If you want to, in the show notes, you can jump forward to it. It's got the timestamp there. But talking about digging deep and diving deep into things, Chloe, do you want to give an update?
Well, we have lots of piles of earth over the fields and a half-finished drainage system.
Yeah, so...
and a lot of mud. If
you haven't listened to the last episode, episode 12, we gave an update, like we do every week on our project, and one of the main things that's happening is drainage being dug, because basically, historically, water just goes straight through the house and the barns here as opposed to around it. So we felt it might be important before the Welsh monsoon rains come. However, despite the valiant efforts, one might say Herculean efforts of our groundswork guys that have been doing this, they've just admitted defeat, basically.
Yeah, first it defeated the dumper, then it was the diggers, and then I think it was them. I think everyone by turn. But the cool thing is we do have quite a lot of piles of earth around the place that look, they look like they might turn into like invertebrate banks in the long term. I just quite worked out.
They're just not in the right place. They're going to have to get moved.
Yeah, that's true.
But they're a great team. We was really unfortunate to hit the rain, literally where it rained solidly and heavily for 2 weeks. However, majority of the work's been done. All the key areas are now covered, so we don't have the torrents of rain going between the houses. So generally, it's a positive.
And I think the swales definitely have wetland vibes.
Definitely.
There's wetland vibes coming.
We'll put some pictures on the Instagram page for that as well. So anything else to update on before we go to the interview?
I think we should talk about your new companion, your walking companion. Who needs a dog when you can have a pickaxe?
The inanimate object.
Yeah.
So I did a post about this on Instagram. Link will be in the show notes. But I have started taking a very large, sharp pickaxe on walks. And it all came from reading something, I don't know where it was. Maybe it was in Book of Wilding. I don't know. But anyway, talking about the value of wild boar wallows. So I just thought, well, I can do that. And why not be productive on a walk as opposed to just having a walk and enjoying nature? Why not carry a pickaxe and at appropriate intervals throughout the walk, create a wild boar wallow? Therefore, not only have we been productive, the dogs have been for a walk, but there's also something valuable for the land as well.
And I'm genuinely excited to see what starts to emerge on that kind of exposed soil next year.
Yeah, and some of the benefits, according to my research, to do with these wild boar wallows is obviously there are no wild boar around where we live.
Nope.
So therefore, and they provide an important role for nature. They provide their own little mini ecosystems, essentially kind of boosting biodiversity via like mini habitats. They attract insects and vertebrates and birds and create a kind of thriving microcosm of life, one might say. And it also, not so much right now, but as we get down into kind of summer months, they can provide a really valuable water source for wildlife as well.
Well, I'm excited to track their progress.
So just before we introduce the podcast, shall we talk about our special bonus episode that will be released between Christmas and New Year?
Yeah, we're testing out something a little bit different this time in that we are going to take some clips from some of the interviews that have happened over the kind of autumn season of the podcast. And I'm going to pick 3 and Tom's going to pick 3. And we're not going to know which we picked. And then we're going to have a debate between us or a discussion between us about why we picked them, why they're raising out for us. And it'll be kind of like I don't want to say greatest hits, but it'll be kind of a sense about some of the conversations that have resonated for us and why they have.
Yeah, that's grandiose greatest hits there, I think. That what I want it to be is a signpost, essentially. For anyone that's new to the podcast, they can listen to that one episode, really get a flavour for some of the great chats we've had and know where they might want to get themselves to learn more.
Yeah.
And, which, is probably as important, if not more, is that we introduce you to one of our first, newest member of the Grange Project team as well.
Yeah, we could not be more excited to be working alongside another fantastic team member, and we look forward to introducing you to her in our next podcast.
Well, let's get into this interview. So when I first chatted to Stephen prior to doing the recording, what gripped me is obviously his passion and knowledge about rewilding and how much he truly cares about the importance of giving it the right name, because that names have power from his perspective. And also how he wasn't scared to kind of have maybe a less mainstream view on some things. And I think that's really exciting for this project and this podcast, because that's what we're trying to achieve, isn't it? We don't want it to be an echo chamber. We want everyone to have the same opinion. We want everyone to be enlightened and be able to learn from each other, even if you don't necessarily align on everything that's discussed.
And as a kind of little hint into the richness of the interview, when I listen back, I've made 10 notes of kind of ideas I wanted to talk more about, things I wanted to debate, discuss. And that's just a snapshot of just how rich the conversation is.
Here he is. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to have a chat. We had our prep call and it was really different, the prep call with you, which I really appreciated. It's nice to speak to people with different views, and I personally really appreciate someone that has an opinion, an ethical position or a personal opinion, but stands by it and doesn't just go with the flow. And I think that's hopefully one of the main topics we're going to pull out here is going, is leaning on your wisdom and your experience to kind of help advise and guide us on our journey. Now, in keeping with the tradition of the podcast, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves. So how do you find yourself in your position that you are in now, and what do you currently do for your day job?
Day job, I'm Senior Lecturer in Geography at the University of Leeds. I'm also Director of the Wildland Research Institute, which is an organisation which was set up just over 10 years ago now to provide policy advice and spatial analysis, so GIS mapping expertise, to a range of clients, governments, NGOs, etc., individual landowners, looking at the wilder end of the landscape continuum. So wilderness areas, wildland areas, target areas for rewilding. I then find myself invited to join with colleagues, the IUCN's, which was then a Rewilding Task Force, and now the Rewilding Thematic Group. So that's a global organisation where we're looking to really bottom out what rewilding is all about and provide a definition and a set of guiding principles.
Which leads us very nicely on to the kind of the first question, which is, I imagine you could probably fill a couple of books in answering this, but what does rewilding mean to you?
It's simple, Paul. We can boil it down to say, giving nature the space and the time to dictate its own outcomes. So there's that well-worn phrase which says nature abhors a vacuum. So if we give nature a blank palette, it will fill it. It'll fill it with species and habitats and ecosystem processes and disturbances, etc. What we get at the end of the day might not necessarily be what we expect, but that's nature filling a void, if you like. So if we step back and allow nature to take its own course, it will do stuff. It'll do interesting stuff. And as I say, some of it might not be what we expected or what we hope to see, but it will be natural. Whether it's wild and native to a particular patch of land is another matter. But, in terms of natural processes, largely in the absence of human interference or influence, that's rewilding.
And is there a scale at which is a minimum requirement for a project to be, under your definition, to be rewilding?
I think it's a fuzzy one, is that. It's not an easy question to answer. But the suggestion that you can rewild a window box in an urban tower block is a bit silly, really. I mean, you can help nature in terms of planting the right things, which, are valuable to wild nature and pollinators or other insects which might benefit from that. But, I think the larger the scale, the better. But it's not just about scale. It's about geographical context. So where it is that we're talking about, and scale will vary depending on the habitats and ecosystems we're actually interested in. Also, definitely that connectivity. So how rewilded landscapes or patches of rewilded land connect up to create something which the sum of the parts is greater than the whole.
Okay, so context, basically. So the answer to that is, it depends.
It depends. So many things, it's easy to ask a question, which it seems pretty straightforward. But then you start going with all the whatabouteries and the wherefores and the therefores, and it is really, at the end of the day, about context. But, we underline everything with the phrase, well, it depends.
I just want to pick back up on something you said a little bit earlier on allowing nature to lead and to kind of do its own thing at its own time, which sounds eminently sensible. What's your thoughts on, I'm just genuinely interested, I suppose, in your perspective on this, is what's your thoughts on, obviously we are in a climate emergency, a biodiversity emergency. Is the position still to be allow nature to take its time, or can there be situations or projects where it is appropriate to support nature along on its journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if again, going back to the definition of rewilding, giving nature space and the time to dictate its own trajectories, we might want to step in and initially give nature a helping hand in that process. So there are two basic parts or definitions or classes of rewilding, if you like. We could talk about passive rewilding, which, example of which might be land abandonment. So, the best, or indeed the worst, if you want to think of it that way, is example of this is Chernobyl and what happened there.
Yeah.
I mean, people evacuated the area literally almost overnight. And nature basically went, woohoo, ignoring the radiological problems. Yeah. Nature suddenly gone, we've got a blank palette here, guys. We can do what we want. We can be ourselves again. And so that it turned into a very rich ecological ecosystem in developing under its own steam, so to speak. I mean, yes, it's been disrupted now by the unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in the Ukraine war. But, that was a good example of a land abandonment and passive rewilding. People saw interesting things happening there, and, then suddenly thought, we need to intervene a little bit, which then takes us down that other avenue of active rewilding, our sort of interventionist, where we might decide that rewilding is a good policy for a particular area, patch of land, ecosystem, landscape, and we step in to remove human influence, actively remove human influence, kickstart the natural processes, whether that's through species reintroductions or whether it's through assisted regeneration of natural habitats, reforestation, for example, and rewetting or river restoration, those sorts of things. That will be a more active approach. So the two basic categories, passive on the one hand, active on the other. And okay, it's a bit of a, not say a false dichotomy, those are two extremes, but, there's a blended approach somewhere in the middle in that, again, back to context, and it depends, what's best for a particular landscape and how can we best achieve those desired end states. And then in itself is a problem. We as humans have short lifespans in the context of ecological landscape scale development, and we want to see things happen quickly. And we maybe have, a sort of vision, a design outcome for a particular project. Or we want to see things happen quickly before we're part of the landscape in another way, pushing up daisies, So, there's a temptation there to rush in and do stuff and not just let nature decide its own trajectories.
Sitting here as probably, I guess our project might be sitting on more the kind of active interventionist end of the rewilding spectrum. And I
that's assuming that we even define this project as rewilding, which we'll come back to, Steve.
Okay, I'm sure we will. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Acknowledging that. So let's just suspend that for the second, because I think we should come back to that. But I guess what I'm interested in is that it feels like you're kind of saying there's a bit of a kind of implicit risk in sitting in too much of the active end of a spectrum. And I suppose I might have misinterpreted that, but I'm kind of curious about what the risk might be of becoming too over-controlling, of allowing nature to fill its own vacuum.
Yep, I think you're right in that there are risks associated with that. I mean, there are distinct advantages depending, it depends, depending what you're trying to do. Let's just take species, biodiversity on its own for a minute, if that's at all possible, is that if a species is locally rare but globally common, then is it actually worth our while, or are we barking up the wrong tree, so to speak, in terms of putting a lot of effort into managing a particular habitat for that particular species in that particular location, and all of the ecological disbenefits that may entail in terms of the wider landscape and ecological processes. So, I mean, it's the nature of traditional conservation to focus in on what are seen to be valued and rare habitats and species, and actively manage for that purpose, to maintain that patch of land or that ecosystem in the condition for which it was originally noted and recognized. So that's active management. However, if a species is, as I say, is locally rare but globally common, is that really missing the point? I can see it being really important if a species is, let's say locally common but globally rare, is to maintain its habitat and core area so it doesn't become extinct. But to spend too much time actively managing for a particular species or habitat, which might be tons of it elsewhere in the world, then maybe that's not the way to go in all circumstances. So what I'm kind of coming around to saying is that because traditional conservation designates sites for a particular interesting species or habitat assemblage or whatever and manages it to keep it like that, that flies in the face of ecological succession. Nature wants to develop, and through the processes of disturbance and succession, sort of maximize biomass for a given unit area, the relevant edaphic conditions that are present, so soil, climate, topography, and keeping ecosystems and species in status through active management kind of flies in the face of that. What I would dearly love to see is a suite or assemblage of landscapes and ecosystems across the country where natural succession is allowed to take place. Quite often say to my students, give an example, a lake. It's the nature of a lake to slowly over time fill up with sediment. Stream water flows in and it's carrying sediment with it. The lake slows the water down. It drops the sediment. So over time, the lake fills up. To simplify things, it becomes a reed bed. The reed bed becomes a marsh, which then becomes a raised bog, and the raised bog becomes a heath, and the heath becomes a forest, and the forest, that's what it's trying to do.
Over a few, weeks, months, yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, many, many hundreds of years. And then so the cycle repeats. Traditional conservation will try to stop that. It'll say, oh, this is an interesting lake, and it's got this species and that species and things. We've got to keep it as a lake, and stop the reed bed encroaching and blah, 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 And so we do this, active management. Rewilding is different from that. It's about allowing, as I said earlier, nature the space and the time to dictate its own trajectories and outcomes. Not something that we want it to do, but something that nature wants to do. I'm not getting me wrong, that has benefits for us. There's side benefits in terms of ecosystem services and landscapes of wonderment, and inspiration and all of that sort of human benefit side of things. But it might not necessarily be what we want it to do initially.
And that actually leads really nicely onto my next question, which is if you're going to articulate what the benefits are of allowing nature that kind of free hand, what would you describe as the main benefits from an ecological perspective?
Well, from an ecological perspective, and this is really important in terms of the core principles of rewilding, is that we need to recognize the intrinsic value of wild nature. It's not about us, it's about it, so to speak. It's about wild nature and the benefits that has for itself, not necessarily for us. But what we need to recognize in the wider scheme of things is that we 100% rely on wild nature for our existence. Ultimately, we are wild animals, although I think as human beings, we've become the exceptional species. We've transgressed the boundary between what you might consider, and this is for some people really controversial, but to some extent, we've become something other than natural. Yes, we are carbon-based life forms, we're mammals, we're all the rest of it. But we've become, through our technology and our society and our culture and our politics and our obsession with capitalist systems and stuff, that we've become something other. So I think maybe it's not necessarily the right question to ask is what, are the benefits of rewilding to us as human beings? It's more, what's the benefits of rewilding to nature, to wild nature in particular? But, coming full circle, I think, we really need to grasp that particular nettle and in terms of the ongoing climate and biodiversity crises and turn that ship around and say, well, if we don't do this, then the age of humans on the planet is questionable. As a dominant species, literally is that serious. So I think, maybe it's the right question to ask, but it's also the wrong question to ask, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, sobering to move this on to something, a lighter note, I'm not sure. I feel like we may get told off here. So we, of course, have started this journey and we didn't have any background in ecology, nature restoration, rewilding, whatever you might call it. So we were inspired by rewilding as a phrase and as a term because we could instantly kind of relate to it and guess that we knew what it meant. Of course, now as we dig into it, it's far more complicated and nuanced appropriately so than we understood. So I suppose I'm keen to get your reflections on your thoughts on our project, and maybe I can give you a little bit more detail on the project just to recap. And then from your reflections, I'd like to understand why you feel words are important, especially when talking about these kind of topics and these kind of projects.
I've looked at your web pages, and we had that conversation before, and I'm getting old. My memory's faded, but not quite that bad. I think what you're doing is great, and I think more people could usefully take a leaf out of your book and do this sort of thing. But yeah, words do matter. And is it rewilding? Question mark over that, because I think rewilding occupies a certain space, as I've described. What you're doing, an ecosystem restoration, rewilding, I think, from my perspective, really is something different. Yes, it occupies a particular space or envelope on the environmental modification spectrum. And just to sort of expand on that, this idea of a spectrum of landscape modification from urban areas at the left-hand end of a line all the way through to wilderness, true wilderness areas at the right-hand end of a line. And as you move from left to right, you see reducing levels of human intervention and management and modification of landscapes. And as you move towards the left, you see increasing levels, so lowering levels of wildness and naturalness. And rewilding occupies a certain segment in the middle somewhere, in that what rewilding is trying to push habitats, landscapes, ecosystems further towards the right, towards the wilderness end of the spectrum. If rewilding is successful, ultimately, it creates new wilderness areas, but it has a limited frame, a window in the middle of that spectrum. So you might start off at the far left in the urban areas with things like, remediation, and then in agri-landscapes, regenerative agriculture fits that more sort of ecological restoration window, if you like, fading into rewilding, where removing human extractive land use entirely from the land and allowing that to go back to nature. So with entirely natural or towards natural habitats without any extractive agriculture. So land which has, albeit use of, let's say, domestic herbivores, so cattle, sheep, etc., as a vector of ecosystem function, of proxies for wild species, if that pressure is, or rather that those animals are taken off land as a meat product, then that's still farming in a way. It's farming in a more regenerative way. So the most famous example in the UK, of course, is Knepp. And, the Knepp estate, they're still farming the land. So the livestock that they have on the land is still controlled, and a meat product is extracted from the land. So therefore, it's still farming. And as I say, if it's farming, it ain't rewilding.
Interesting.
Somewhere on the spectrum, and I would say for Knepp, at best, it's rewilding light, rather than a rewilding max approach, but it is still a farm at the end of the day. So, that's a question you've got to ask yourselves, what are those animals for? Are they there as an ecological disturbance mechanism, which modifies ecological trajectories from current state to some future state? Or are they there as a cash crop, if you like, producing a meat product? And, at Knepp, they are definitely both of those things. They are a vector of ecological disturbance, but they're also there to produce a meat product, and it's a high value meat product, which is sold at a premium because of where it's from and how it's raised. But that still makes it a farm. So therefore, I think it fits in the regenerative agriculture basket rather than the rewilding basket.
Following that, if Knepp or indeed us wanted to fully subscribe to your kind of definition of rewilding, what would they need to be? What would we need to be doing kind of differently? Because I guess my understanding is that we have to remove some, or indeed Knepp have to remove some of the animals from their site because there are no other predators that would be doing that. So I'm kind of curious about what you'd be suggesting for those of us that are not fortunate enough to own Yellowstone National Park and therefore the picture.
Yeah, this is absolutely, and it's a tricky one in a relatively small and compartmentalized landscape like the UK. In that, we want to do various things here. One is rewild at landscape scale, and of course we're limited by various things. Scale of the landscape for one, land ownership is another. Some of the laws about fences and prey and predator in the same enclosure really create problems there. So NEP is, whatever it is, a big estate, but it is split into compartments, and although the herbivores are free-ranging, they are free-ranging within limits. And so there are fences. In smaller landscapes in the UK, Europe, elsewhere, where there are these conflicting land pressures, we're not talking Yellowstone here, then you have to split the landscape up into blocks using fences or proxies for fences, so these, GPS color things, these invisible fence line type approaches. So with NEP, taking that as an example, I actually asked Charlie a while ago, I said, look, Charlie, how do you decide how much meat to harvest from the land? And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, if you take too much off, then the natural regenerative capacity of the scrub and the forest will mean that it outstrips the grazing pressure because you're taking a substantial meat harvest off the land and keeping the herd small. The habitat will trend towards closed canopy woodland. And they agree. So if you take too little off, then the natural fecundity of the herd will mean that the herd size will grow and grow, similar to what happened at Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands, to such an extent that the grazing capacity outstrips the regenerative capacity of the scrub and the forest. And you will end up with, and I said at the time, you'll end up with Netvaardersplassen. You end up with this savanna grassland with no trees. So, the question is, how much meat do you decide to take off the land? And he goes, well, I've taken off to get wood pasture. And that was it. That was the answer, is that Charlie wanted wood pasture. He wanted this landscape of open parkland, grassland with a few trees here and there, which, is a capability style sort of Serengeti in the southern counties type landscape. So that was predicated on some desired outcome. And that is going back to our earlier conversation about human intervention in assisted rewilding and desired outcomes within our limited lifespan. That hits to the nub of the problem. Fences, herbivores, no predatory pressure because the landscape's too small, requires human intervention. And that human intervention is then guided by some desired outcome. And in the NEP instance, the desired outcome is wood pasture.
So then is rewilding in the UK, for example, is that even achievable, practically achievable? Because of the scenarios you gave where either we have too many herbivores and they turn, or we're too little, and then it has to be managed at some level in those two examples, or three examples if you include NEP as well. So is it even possible to achieve the holy grail of the rewilding concept that you're alluding to?
It's limited, I think. It's limited by land ownership, it's limited by scale, it's limited by aspiration. So I think if you look at Rewilding Britain, they have an aspiration to the 30 by 30 vision of 30% restored landscape. So I think target 2 or is it target 3? I can't remember. The Kunming-Montreal agreement says that we should look towards restoring 30% of our landscapes to high biodiversity. So Rewilding Britain have that target, but they're only saying, well, 5% of that will be core rewilded areas. And then you've got to ask the question, what does that actually mean? Where are they going to be? So if you look at you can map any area. And we've done this is my area of specialism, the global scales down to local scales. You can take any sort of geographical window and you can map its ecological integrity and wildness, if you like, using various attributes such as human modification, land cover, remoteness, those kind of indices. And if you look at the UK as an island, it's always handy to have an island because you don't have edge effects, particularly in the terrestrial sense anyway. You can map a continuum, that landscape continuum that we were talking about earlier, you can map it from least wild to most wild. So it's relatively easy in a country like the UK to identify the top 5% wildest areas. those could be your core rewilding locations because they are already pretty ecologically natural. They're a long way from human population. They're not really being used for extractive human land use, maybe a bit of light grazing or some forestry. So it's relatively easy to identify where those areas are. I would say that Rewilding Britain needs to be a bit more ambitious and say like 10% core. That matches with the European Union of identifying 10% for strong nature protection. And we could do that. The other 25% or the other 20%, if we go for the 10% core, would be regenerative agriculture. So acknowledging that many of our marginal areas of agricultural land are subject to some level of agricultural pressure, whether that's rough grazing or whether it's a silvicultural pressure, so plantation forest, or indeed water resources, then we could identify those landscapes. That doesn't say that there's no room for little, smaller bits in between, because I think going back to the issue of connectivity, then your land could be a stepping stone between some of these larger patches. And so this is what we're doing with Rewilding Britain at the moment at Leeds University, is where we've been mapping ecological integrity and connectivity at the national scale to enable a more strategic approach to identifying where the key areas of rewilding might be, to connect up or to improve the ecological connectivity between these core areas. And so it depends on how you slice it up. So my big question about the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, I said, this is great, by the way, I'm just saying, targets 1, 2, and 3 are really where what we're talking about here. But nowhere in that agreement did it say how we're going to do that. Are they global targets? Are they continental targets or national targets? Or indeed, are we better looking across national boundaries and looking at these targets and saying, we want to protect 30% of all of the savanna landscapes and 30% of all the woodland landscapes and 30% of all the desert landscapes. So at least we have the best 30% of each of these representative global ecosystems protected for wild nature. So I would have loved to have seen that somewhere in that agreement is exactly how we're going to do that. And, it's a tricky one. And indeed, the rest of the target, a lot of the remaining targets were all about the role of, society and indigenous cultures in meeting those targets. Because if you look at, let's say, if it was a global target, where's the top 30%? Well, if we ignore all the snow and ice around the world, then a lot of those 30% areas will be areas of, which are predominantly occupied by indigenous cultures. So it's a matter of, where the cookie crumbles and, where the axe falls, or it's not good. That's not a good metaphor. It's how you slice the world up. And, we can look at that at a UK level. How do we slice the UK up? Do we say England, Scotland, and Wales? Or do we look at it in the biomes, mountains, coasts, forests? We don't have many wild grasslands anymore for obvious reasons, but you see where I'm driving at.
Yeah, and what you're suggesting there takes a huge amount of political will to be able to put something like that together. And just bringing it back, not that I can't let go of things, although I'm sure Chloe will tell you that's probably quite accurate. But we chose the Rewilding name, and we're moving more towards wilder Wales or whatever it is now, and trying to find out where we sit. And maybe we don't sit on the rewilding side, but we chose that because we did want to connect with the people who don't understand. So in order to achieve that kind of political will, we've got to make sure we bring the general public, myself included, along with us on the journey. So yes, calling things the right name is important, but then what is the risk with changing the name from Rewilding to something else that maybe people can't relate to as easily? And then on the flip side of that is what are the risks of misapplication? So everyone calling it Rewilding when it's not.
Yeah, I see what you're driving at. It's a tricky one. I never really liked the word rewilding to begin with. It's problematic in that the re-bit, some people kind of screams, we're trying to turn the clock back to some sort of prehistoric landscape. Whereas, the re can really just be about reinstating. But, I always view rewilding as not trying to go back to some previous era, before intensive agriculture or wherever. It's more of a forward-looking approach. It's about future landscapes, and as I said before, in terms of the biodiversity and climate crisis, we've got to do that. It has become a bit of a bandwagon, and as a result of it becoming this populist bandwagon, every Tom, Dick and Harry or Harriet is perhaps wanting to call their project rewilding or label it as rewilding. If it's moving it along that landscape continuum to be slightly wilder or, a lot wilder depending, that's great. But is it actually rewilding? So in terms of the global IUCN definition of rewilding, then it occupies, as I say, a certain window on that landscape spectrum. So I do no mow. I don't have the luxury of having a large patch of land or a farm or whatever. I've got a small urban garden. I do my little bit where I can, but so I've been doing no mow for ages because I'm lazy. And
there's a good reason for it.
I do like to see the wildflowers in my lawn. It's not rewilding, yet it has certain local ecological benefits in terms of wildflowers and pollinating insects and blah 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 blah. But it ain't rewilding. It sits in a suburban landscape. And as much as I would love to rewild somewhere, I'm not a rich man and I don't have those kinds of funds. And my hat's off to you for doing what you've done because you've shown commitment to that lifestyle and doing your bit, so to speak. But yeah, we can all do our bit by No Mow May or, the RSVB's Build It and They Will Come program and things, doing our little bits for nature. But I do think, rewilding occupies a certain niche. And to try to turn rewilding as a movement, as an ecological concept in nature conservation, to make it apply to everything is wrong. Somebody much more clever than I, a guy called Tony Sinclair, in a presentation he did about 6 years ago now, said, in conclusion to his presentation, he said, if a term, be it ecological restoration or rewilding, applies to everything, then it also means nothing. And so, yes, that's it. Rewilding is something different. We have in the past been forced into a mode of conservation which is about putting a line around a patch of land and saying, oh, this is interesting. We need to keep it like it is and managing it as such. That's traditional fortress conservation. Rewilding is a different approach. It's about turning that on its head and saying, well, okay, we perhaps need the boundaries, and that's where our mapping comes in, or at least target areas. But it's about saying, well, no, it's not about what we want. It's about that intrinsic value of nature and what nature wants to be, and all of the benefits, the side benefits to humans and the huge benefits to wild nature that entails. There was a paper a few years ago by Hayward et al. Which looked at just describing rewilding as this kind of Pandora's box, the king's new clothes type thing for conservation, and saying that there's nothing new about rewilding. Well, I would counter that and say, well, rewilding is a kind of restoration, but not all restoration is rewilding. And we came up with a model which I think is quite useful. And so if you think about ecological restoration, whether that's regenerative agriculture or high nature value farming or river restoration or coastal realignment or whatever, there are definite endpoints to those processes, those interventions, but using natural processes to achieve them. So we would say that ecological restoration as an approach, it's human-led, but nature-enabled. So it's about us as humans using natural processes to get to a particular desired endpoint. And if that's a restored river or it's a high nature value farm or whatever, that's restoration. So human-led, nature-enabled. Rewilding's different. Rewilding is the opposite of that. So rewilding, we would say, is nature-led, human-enabled. So it's nature determining, back to our definition at the start, it's nature determining its own trajectories and outcomes. At some point in the future, maybe it's open-ended, and we're just allowing that to happen. So we're giving it the space and allowing it the time for that to actually happen. The opposite, the flip, if you like, from ecological restoration and traditional conservation.
I feel like Tom and I are going to have to listen back to this interview and look at all of the wording on our website and think a bit about how we're positioning ourselves and what our intentionality is and where do we sit on active and passive. And I think for me, it's brought up loads of questions, which I think is, a good conversation.
Positionality, so I got pulled up in a meeting a couple of months ago about my positionality in respect to, something else about wilderness. I'm a white, Western, middle-aged Yorkshireman, and so that gives me a certain positional outlook on things. And it's really difficult to think about nature conservation and rewilding and restoration and all these things from the point of view of, I keep saying this about intrinsic value of nature, its own right to exist. It's really difficult for us to do that, but we have the brains to sort of try to think outside our own beings and acknowledge that. So you as a young couple with a vision on a piece of land, it's Monmouthshire, isn't it? That gives you a certain positionality. And, I think you've got to be to some extent, I think, a little bit cautious and cognizant of the Welsh cultural history that are embedded within man. Look at the failure of the Summit to Sea program. I was initially involved with that at one level doing the mapping. And at one point I was asked would I like to be the scientific lead on that. And I said, well, I'm in Leeds, not in Aberystwyth. I'm not Welsh. I kind of backed off at that point. I said, yeah, well, thanks for asking, but no thanks. I could just see the problems starting to bubble up with the rewilding term in a Welsh cultural rural setting.
But on that note, you're right. But then, you were saying that maybe we were more on the regenerative agriculture side of life. But I'm pretty sure that there's a number of Welsh farmers screaming at the podcast right now, assuming they listen to it. I'm sure they do. Hello, guys and girls. But, saying that, hang on, these guys aren't doing regenerative agriculture. How dare you suggest and sully our good hard work? So the risk and the concern, of course, is that you end up sitting in no man's or person's land. Let's be more specific going forward. And obviously we're not going to get...
No, we're not going to answer all those questions.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I kind of meant to say when you asked about, Claire, how we're going to make this work, and there's another little model, it's difficult to describe, but if you imagine two triangles, one with its broad base on the bottom and the other one with its broad base at the top, both intersecting. So there's a diamond shape where the two triangles intersect. The top triangle represents government policy and fiscal mechanisms. So getting government level policy, let's say on a 30 by 30 vision and the top 30% for restoration and biodiversity protection, or the 10% strong protection target, get that right with the correct and appropriately funded fiscal mechanisms, then the bottom-up buy-in to rewilding, you're going to get that community-level landowner buy-in because they see the sweet spot in the middle, that diamond shape where the two triangles intersect, as being the sweet spot. So you get that bottom-up buy-in, aided and allowed, functionalized by that top-level policy, top-down policy. So where the bottom-up joins the top-down, that's the sweet spot. I think getting that right is going to allow rewilding in certain circumstances to happen, such that we can identify 10% of the UK landscape for core rewilding and another 20 for regenerative agriculture. There's still got to be places for intensive agriculture because we've got to put food on the table. I'm as fond of my food and my beer as anybody else. So, nobody's saying rewild everywhere. It is quite a niche approach, but it will have benefits far beyond its immediate boundaries and its relative size.
Yeah.
So I think, as long as it's properly funded and enough people buy in, and that's one of our guiding principles of rewilding. I think it's principle 6 is that, if there isn't that community level buy-in, it ain't going to happen. It needs people to accept it and go with it.
Agreed. I think that's a really nice and strong thought to finish this interview and chat on. Thank you very much for your thoughts, your insights, your debate and discussion. I feel like I'd love you to come down here for a pint so we can have, or a gin and tonic or non-alcoholic spirits to continue this chat and obviously just get your thoughts on it on the land. But thank you for giving us your time. I appreciate you. It's a busy time.
Well, let's do that. And I certainly look forward to it. And best of luck to you both.
Thank you.
Oh, I don't really know where to start, Tom. There are so many things, as I said at the end of the interview, that I wanted to kind of discuss with you and debate with you. And I found that this is probably one of the most thought-provoking interviews so far in terms of really making me question what we're doing, the intentionality of that. And I guess some of those wider debates about what is the value of a name. And, you know, I guess from someone that works in an academic context, I understand the need for things to have rigour. But equally, there's something about we are kind of socially constructing these ideas as well. And is there value in that being a social movement? And then I got myself a bit confused.
Yeah, and I echo everything you just said, really. It's hard to unpick it because from a marketeer's perspective, I am desperate for the fight about biodiversity loss, climate change to become more and more mainstream. I want to engage more people and have them all coming on board with something simple that they can grasp and hold. Even if it's not even described appropriately or clearly, we're lacking that unifying place to belong. And I really do see rewilding as that place, that word, that term that people can connect to. Having said that, when you hear someone of Stephen's kind of knowledge and experience articulating why it's important to call things by their correct name, the way he defines it, you kind of sit there going, you're right. Yeah. And we're probably not rewilding, but that probably doesn't matter because we are all these other things like he explains. And it gets me like kind of really excited as well because it means that there's room for everybody in this. And the more we learn, the more opportunities present themselves.
Yeah, and I guess that's why we do start a lot of interviews by saying, well, what does rewilding mean to you? Because recognising that everyone's going to have their own relationship with the term and that I guess there's no one truth about what rewilding is unless, well, I guess there's an academic truth. There might be a kind of movement truth. There might be a truth for us as an individual, for us in the Grange Project. And I think one of the things I really took away was him talking about, you've got to allow nature time and you've got to let go of the outcomes. And I think those are two such hard things for humans to do because I think fundamentally we're not very patient. And the idea of letting things happen over many lifetimes, I think is a difficult one for us to hold on to. Even though I think we're trying to let go here and we're kind of being curious and we want to see what happens, we do have a hope of what it might look like and it will look more diverse, that we'll get more wildlife. And obviously that isn't and is that enough of an intention for it to be too controlled? I don't know.
Well, like Stephen says, that's why he wouldn't define this as rewilding because like he said with the example of the lakes or ponds, they are going to get silted up and then, and then grow. But we don't have that space here. We have to, if a pond or a lake gets dug, because we only have 80 acres here, that's where probably the pond or lake needs to stay. So we're going to have to maintain that. So we just don't have the ability to let nature do its own thing all the time because there's just maintenance that has to happen because of the scale.
And I think we are feeling pressure to do something, to not just to be passive and to watch, because I guess maybe my fear, maybe I don't want to speak for you, is that if we just did nothing, that it would look exactly the same in 5 years and people would be like, what, you just let it go back for nature and it just looks the same. That would be kind of my worry.
Yeah, but I care less about what other people think and more about pulling this back to why we are doing this. Mm-hmm. And because we believe it is such an emergency and because we decide to step out of the mainstream of our professional careers in order to help address this, I think it's that important that we can't just sit back and assume that it's okay because over 3 lifetimes this is going to achieve what we want to achieve. We have to, as Dr. Ali Driver says from Rewilding Britain, rewilding is a marathon with a sprint start, and we very much are at that sprint start of our process here, even if it may not be academically rewilding.
No, definitely. And I liked his last kind of model that I think he talked about, these 2 triangles and the need for there to be support from government and funding sources to enable that nature recovery, nature restoration, whatever you want to, to happen. And it was making me think about how a lot of our funding at the moment is targeted for quite fixed states. If you want to create a pond and you want funding from the Great Crested Newts people, then you need to make sure that stays a pond because that's the focus of their funding. They want to encourage a habitat for newts. So I understand that there's an intention they're having, but that doesn't really fit with this idea of, let's just see what happens. So it is going to be interesting and I guess that'll be interesting in terms of how it fits in with biodiversity net gain for those in England around funding sources for rewilding.
I do wonder how a NEP would respond to Stephen's perspective on what they're doing. Now, I suspect it would be something along the lines of, this is what we define as rewilding, and rewilding has to pay. It has to make money in order to make it a sustainable solution. Like with our chat with Chris in the last episode, we've got to make sure this is intergenerational. This change here for the long term. Yeah, so his example of that inverted triangle, I think, really just continues to be a common theme throughout a number of our conversations we have.
one of the outcomes from us of the interview with Stephen is that we did go away and make a few changes to our text to describe things more as wilding than rewilding. And I completely agree with him that I'm not sure the re is super helpful, because it does make us almost think about we're aiming for a historic fixed state in a way, as opposed to the kind of future possibilities. But are you going to get subtitle knots about it? But I would wonder whether we're going to spend our entire podcast for the next 5 years being like rewilding or wilding or nature conservation or, or nature
recovery
or whatever you want to call it. Like, are we going to do that whenever we introduce it, or can we just stick to something that works for us rather than always trying to qualify what we mean when we say rewilding or wilding or whatever? I'm doing it again.
It's a really fair point. But you and I can have a conversation right now, decide we're going to call it wilding going forwards or whatever. It doesn't matter. But people that engage with our podcasts, maybe the next time might be the first episode they listen to, and they won't have understood the backstory and the reason why we've chosen to pick wilding as the term and the complexity around it. So that's why I think we continue to make sure we clarify things, because we want to make sure that people understand what we mean when we say these things. It's hard. I don't know.
No, I think you're right. Hopefully our regular listeners will appreciate every single time you say that. We think of Stephen and we think about the importance of language.
Right. Is that it? Are we there through? I mean, we could talk about, probably sit here all evening, have a cheeky eggnog and...
yeah, I'm not sure anyone wants to listen to that.
And keep going. That could be a great episode. Chloe and Tom, bottle of wine. Done.
I'm not sure. Listeners are ready for that.
And those that know Chloe. So, well... all that's left is for us to wish everybody listening, we really, truly do appreciate you listening and taking your time. It's wonderful speaking to people that listen to the podcast, hearing from them, hearing the journeys that different people are going on. So from Chloe and I and the family, we wish you a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and 2024, I think, is going to be an extremely exciting new year.
It is.